Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at. Thank you for joining us today on how to configure an event in TeamRaiser. My name is Mark Becker. I'm the founding partner of Cathexis Partners, and we've been doing this for over 12 years now. We've been a Blackbaud partner, have implemented hundreds of clients and literally thousands of campaigns in the TeamRaiser environment, and you're gonna be in great hands today with Jeff, who's going to show you around the system here in a minute. But just a little bit of housekeeping first of all. You should see in the control panel a questions area to chat any questions you have. Everybody's going to be on mute besides myself and Jeff. I will try to answer questions along the way. I'll quickly get in over my head, and there'll be time left at the end also for us to answer any questions you have. But as you're thinking of questions, feel free to drop them into the questions area, and we'll ask them along the way. We want to make sure we address all the questions that you might have. It's a very big topic. It's a very robust product, can be complex with a lot of options in there. So with no further ado, I am going to hand it off to Jeff.
Hi, good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Reinier. I'm a developer with Cathexis Partners. I've been consulting with Cathexis since about the middle of 2012. I've been doing this for quite a while. And I'm really looking forward to working through today's topic. Today we'll be, as Mark mentioned, talking about configuring an event within TeamRaiser. So we'll be talking about identifying an event, your ability to set various options, associate upsells, such as presenting the option of purchasing a tote, umbrella, a t-shirt, things like that, in conjunction with registration. We'll talk about creating and managing your participation types. We'll talk about customizing suggested messages that your users can use from the Participant Center, your event pages, event URLs. We'll talk about how to test drive the event. We'll talk about configuring cross-references if you are leveraging an external database that is synchronized with Luminate Online. And then we'll talk about, finally, publishing your event and making it accessible to your participants. So, that being said, let's go ahead and jump into how to create a TeamRaiser event. So I'm going to switch over to my browser window where I am logged in to Luminate Online, and I'm looking at the administrator homepage. So to start, from here, we want to navigate to Fundraising, TeamRaiser. This will bring us to a list of our existing TeamRaisers that we have in our Luminate environment. So let's go ahead and start by creating a TeamRaiser event. So we'll call this our 2020 TeamRaiser event. So the first option is always going to be naming our event. And we'll notice that to the left of this option is a little icon of three little people. This icon indicates that this option will be visible to your participants in some way on the front end. So not every option will be visible exactly as we establish it. Just be aware that these options can, in some way, be visible to those who visit your website. So once we establish our name, we can override what's called the security category. If you're not sure what this is, or you don't have an explicit purpose, you should leave the security category set to general. Next is our event date. This is specifically when our event will occur. If it is a run, walk, or bike-a-thon sort of event where we're having a physical event, or if it's a virtual event, this is when registration will close. Next is our default TeamRaiser status. We can set this to be unpublished or published when I finish the initial identification process. Next, we have the ability to assign our donation form. So we can either assign an existing donation form, or we can create a new responsive donation form for this TeamRaiser. If we opt to create a new donation form, it will also create a new donation campaign that will house this form. So the campaign will share the name of the public event that we establish here. Next is our merchant account. You may have multiple merchant accounts associated with your Luminate Online environment, and if you know that you need to assign something other than the default merchant account, you can click the drop-down arrow and change that merchant account designation. Next is our initial participation type name. I like to set participant as my default type. It's generic, it's simple, and straightforward. Next is our initial participation type registration fee. This is the registration fee that we are asking users to pay during the registration process. So we'll say that by default, this is going to be 0. We can always change it later if necessary. Once we're satisfied with our initial options, we can click on Finish. Our event will be created, and it will kick us back to our list of TeamRaiser events. So let me go ahead and find the TeamRaiser I just created, our 2020 TR event, and under Action, I'm going to click on Edit. Edit allows us to edit or modify the TeamRaiser event configuration and associated options. So this brings us to the authoring wizard. The authoring wizard, you'll see it throughout Luminate Online when you're working on various modules. We'll have steps outlined on the left-hand side, and we'll have options on the right-hand side. The first item that we have, the first option under step 1, identify event, is our administrative name. So we have an administrative name and a public event name. So we can assign different names if we need to. So the administrative name is what will show in our TeamRaiser event list, and we can also leverage it for reporting purposes. The public event name is what will display in the top tab when users visit the front end of the website. Next, we have a description. This is not mandatory, but you can leverage it. So sometimes it shows up depending on how you have things configured, but typically it's safe to omit a description. Next, we see our security category listing again. Again, if you don't have an explicit purpose, you should probably leave the security category set to general. Next is our event date. So we already established the event date when we were initially creating it, but if we need to change the event date, if it's been postponed for any reason, we can reassign that event date here. Next is our registration cutoff date. This determines when the registration will be cut off. In other words, we have an event set, let's say in December, and we want users to stop being able to register in November. We can set a cutoff date. Now, we have a fiscal year option. This is not something that users see. This is not something that will affect or impact the TeamRaiser functionality. It is something specific for reporting purposes. We have previous event association. This allows us to associate our event with the previous TeamRaiser event that exists in our Luminate environment. Now, one of the big draws to this is that it allows your returning participants to pull over their personal image or video and content from their personal page from the previous event year into the new event year. This can potentially at times be confusing when you're new to the system, because what may happen is the user may register for your new event, and when you look at their pages, you might see dates or references to the previous event. The reason why that happens is they participated previously and it pulled over the content from that previous event into their new personal page. So just be aware of that. It might be a little confusing. Just know that, you know, it's on the participant to update their content when you're leveraging this previous event association. Now, if we know that we have an event that exists in our system, but we're not seeing it listed in the dropdown, just click on this More button down below, and we'll get a little pop-up window, and we'll see a list of all our existing TeamRaiser events. All we need to do is select the radio button, and it will assign that event as our previous event association. Next, we have event types. We have primary event type 2, and event type 3. Primary event can have limited effect on what users might see, such as if you read the description, upsells at companies, and it can also affect some reports. Event type 2 and 3 typically will only affect your reporting and won't affect your front-end functionality or appearance. Now, there is a caveat to that. If you're leveraging one of the Cathexis wrapper templates for TeamRaiser, you can leverage event type 2 to assign a unique look and set of options for your TeamRaiser. Otherwise, if you're not leveraging that, you can ignore typically event type 2 and 3. Once we have assigned our options and we're satisfied with our changes, we can click Next to save our changes and move on to the next step. Be aware that if you don't click Next, and if we just click in the authoring wizard, our changes will be lost. So be sure that if you have made changes and you need them to be saved, make sure you click Next or Save to save your changes, and don't just click on the left-hand side. So I'm going to click Next, and this brings us to step 2, select fundraising options. So from here, we see the various fundraising options that we can establish for our event. First is our donation form. So we can see our event donation campaign and donation form that were created in the initial identification process when I first created this. So we won't be able to get into the nuances of modifying or tweaking a TeamRaiser donation form. Just know that this is where we can assign a unique donation form if and as needed. Next is our event fundraising goal. So typically I will advise that you leverage this. What this is you can assign a goal that is unique and different from the goal specified within your donation campaign. So you check this box, and then option 3, fundraising goal amount, becomes active, and we can assign a new goal. The goal that we assign here will inform the progress meter that is visible on our TeamRaiser greeting page. So let's say I want to raise $30,000 or set $30,000 as my fundraising goal for this TeamRaiser event. I enter 30,000, and I have established my goal. Now, let's look at additional donations and multiple registrations. So first, additional donations. This allows us to present the option of offering the user the ability to make an additional gift during registration. So this just presents a field where the user can enter a monetary amount in addition to any registration fees. So this can be useful for things like the personal achievement badge, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Next is the multiple registrations. This allows you to present your registrants with an option to register an additional friend or family member prior to completing or submitting their registration. So on the confirm registration page, where what the user sees is an overview of their TeamRaiser registration and the options that they've set. There is an additional button then that says register an additional friend or family member or something along those lines, depending on how you configure your event. And this can potentially be confusing. Just be aware of that, because what happens is it does not require a unique email. So what can happen is Jane Doe walks through her registration and then decides that she wants to register John Doe in addition. And so when Jane clicks the button and walks through the additional registration process, she does not have to enter a unique email address. And so what may happen is John Doe gets registered for this TeamRaiser event using Jane Doe's email address. And the reason why this can potentially be confusing for your users is that John Doe will not receive his autoresponder messages or any coaching emails that you may send out. Those will instead be sent to Jane Doe's email address. So Jane will be responsible for forwarding those to John. So if you're aware of that and you're prepared to field questions like, why is XYZ participant not receiving these emails, or why am I receiving seemingly duplicate autoresponders, it's because of the multiple registrations. So just be aware of that. Next, we can assign a unique tax ID if necessary for this event. Next, on the left-hand side, we'll see that there are some related actions, and we'll see this off and on throughout the TeamRaiser authoring wizard. So the fundraising goals and recruitment goals typically can be ignored and omitted. What we want to focus on is the personal gift achievement badge. So I'm going to click on this, and this allows us to assign a badge that can show up on the participant's page when they make a gift on their own behalf. So let's say we have enabled the option for an additional gift during registration, and we configure the personal gift achievement badge. When the user completes the registration, they'll have a badge on their personal page showing that they've made a gift. So we can check the box to enable it. We can search our image library to identify an image that's already been uploaded, or we can click on Choose File to browse our desktop for an image that we want to use for the badge. Next, we can enter a name for the badge. And then we can also enter a description. So it can say, has made a donation to this event, or I jump-started my fundraising. So whatever works, typo, there we go. So whatever works for your use case scenario, this can help promote users to make a gift, jumpstart their own fundraising, and give them a little something to show their dedication to the cause. So once I've assigned or configured the personal gift achievement badge, I click Finish, and it brings me back to step 2, select fundraising options. So let's go ahead. I clicked on the additional action without saving my custom goal, so I lost that. So now that I've re-entered that, I'm going to click Save. So now I can either navigate with the left-hand side or click Next. So I'm going to go ahead, in this case, I'm going to click Next and move on to step 3, select event options. So here we can assign some various event options. So first is the personal page customization. This determines whether or not users are able to customize their own pages. And the vast majority of scenarios, you should maintain this option. The first button should be checked, allowing your participants to customize their personal pages. Now, if you want to have some control over the customizations, allowing your admins to review that, those are things that can be enabled, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Next option is Participant Center Gift Status. This determines whether or not unconfirmed gifts are listed in the Participant Center. Next is our participant fundraising goal. You should typically allow participants to enter a fundraising goal. In conjunction with that, we can suggest a goal for our users. So we can say, you can set 200 as a target goal, and then they can determine whether or not that's a feasible goal for themselves and then set their own goal. Next, we can suggest a team fundraising goal. Typically, this will be larger than your suggested participant fundraising goal. Next, we can assign interest categories to be associated with this event, meaning if somebody registers for this event, any interest assigned here will be flagged on their constituent record. Next is the participant center for this TeamRaiser. If you have multiple TeamRaiser events, you will be able to, if you have multiple participant centers configured within your Luminate environment, you can determine which participant center you want to assign. You just click the drop-down arrow and then assign the participant center that you want. If we set an event type 1 on the Identify TeamRaiser step, we can see that listed here. Typically, it's safe to ignore this. This typically really doesn't have too much impact, but it may show up depending on how you have things configured. Option 9 is our event affiliation. This allows us to determine whether events should be affiliated. This can affect some progress meters, allowing them to roll up together to show a total for multiple events, and can also affect certain roll-up reports, allowing you to report across multiple TeamRaiser events. Next is registration limit type. If we need to limit the number of seats available for our TeamRaiser event, we can limit those, so we can do that event-wide, or we can allow that to be done on a participant type level. So if I check registrations for the event, a box is revealed and I enter a numeric value to determine what the registration limit is for this whole event. And then we can also just check the radio for each participation type, and then those limits are assigned then at the participation type level. So I'm going to go ahead and click check none, and I'm going to save my changes. And before I move on to step 4, select team option, I want to take a look at some of our related actions here on the left-hand side. First is edit event questions. When I click on this, this allows me to configure questions to present to my participants during the registration process. So I can do things like ask users about their t-shirt size, ask them how they heard about our event, or how they heard about our organization, ask if they have any affiliations with our organization or our mission prior to this event. So let's go ahead and take a look at quickly creating a question. I click on Create a New Question, and in the dropdown, I'm going to click on Short Text Value to create a basic text input field. I'm going to click Next, and now I can enter my question text, and I can ask, what's your t-shirt size? And then I can determine whether or not this question is required. And then there's an option to present this question only to event managers or administrators, which will be presented to them if they are registering a participant through the back end. Next, we have a security category option. Typically, you should just keep this set to general unless if you have an explicit purpose to change it. Finally, one of the cool things about this, this feature is that we can configure a question to update the constituent 360 record for this registrant. So what we can do is we can, for instance, store this to our Cons 360 database, and we can leverage it for things like queries and reporting after the event is over. So you can find it super beneficial for a myriad of applications. There's far too many to really get into, but just be aware that our custom questions can be leveraged to update the constituent record in addition to simply storing this value with the registration record, the TeamRaiser registration record, that is. So once I've finished creating my question, I click on Finish, and it will bring me back to the question list. And here I can see my list of questions. We can change the order of our questions as they're presented in the registration flow. Multiple questions are listed, and the order is presented here from 1 to whatever. And to change the order, we simply change the number designation in the corresponding questions that we need to change their order for. And then the last thing to touch on this page is the Include This Question option. On the right-hand side, we have a checkbox. We can check this to determine whether or not this question is included in the registration flow. So for now, let's go ahead and check this box. So once I'm done, I can click on Finish, and this will bring me back to Step 3, Select Event Options. Now, under Related Actions, let's go ahead and talk about our advanced options. Let's click on this. This allows us to define a myriad of additional event options. We can see that this has taken us into a whole subflow under event options. So there's too many options for us to touch on in detail here, but I'm going to cover on some of the most commonly used and most important options. So one of the big ones that you might have is allowing participants to record offline gifts that they receive, meaning users can go into the participant center and enter a gift. And next is fundraising totals includes unconfirmed gifts. This determines whether or not a gift that has been pledged but not yet received or marked as confirmed, whether or not it shows up in the fundraising totals. Next, we can determine the payment types that users can enter into their participant center. So we can choose to allow or omit credit card processing or entry from our participants. Next is this checkbox to determine whether or not participants can input credit card information. And then we have offline gift payment recording by administrator. And then we have the ability to determine whether or not our status indicators will either include the value of registration fees or whether they will actually include whether, our top fundraisers, top participants, and top teams, whether or not they will display gift amounts at all. So you don't have to show gift amounts when you're looking at the top participant or top teams lists. You can choose to hide those if you don't want to display those. Next, a common one that you probably will want to leverage is the fundraising milestones. We check this box to determine whether fundraising milestones are leveraged. If you're not familiar, a fundraising milestone is an option which we can set where if a user fundraises to a certain threshold, we can enable a badge to be displayed on their personal fundraising page, and or we can optionally notify administrators that a participant has reached a certain fundraising threshold or milestone. Coinciding with option 14 is option 15, where we can choose how many milestones are leveraged, or rather the maximum number of milestones that can be leveraged. And then we have this registration anonymous checkbox and registration public view checkbox. These can somewhat work in concert. What they do is they present checkbox during the registration flow that allows a user to either be anonymous if they make an additional gift during registration, or whether or not they want to hide their gift from the top honor rolls when they make a gift during registration. So registration anonymous specifically allows them to make their name anonymous, and the public view checkbox option determines whether or not they can hide the value of their additional gift during registration. And then we have, finally, option 18, team roster displays amount raised by participants. This determines whether or not our team rosters will display the fundraising amounts that have been achieved by each individual.
Honey, I'm in a meeting right now. Is everything okay?
Next is our donations to registration transaction processing. We should make sure that this is enabled. Next, we click next to save our changes and move on to step B, define event options. And so here we have a couple of options that we're going to talk about specifically. So the first is participant page modified notification. This allows administrators to be notified when a participant has made a modification to their personal page. So this allows you to kind of keep tabs or keep a pulse on the sort of content that users are entering onto their personal page. Next is personal page availability after registration. This determines whether or not the user's page can be found in searches prior to being approved. Now, this coincides with option 9 down below, participant personal page modification approval. This determines whether or not your administrators must approve a personal page change before said change becomes visible. So you can use some of these options in concert together to help keep tabs on the content that's being added by your participants. Next, we have participant personal page blogs. Option 8, this allows you to determine whether or not your participants will have a blog functionality that they can leverage from within their participant center. So they can use this to chronicle their fundraising progress. For instance, if it's a long period bike-a-thon or you have various challenges that you're setting forth for your fundraisers, they can list and detail for their supporters their progress. Next is participant team self-management. This determines whether or not users can manage their team membership from within their participant center, meaning if somebody registers with the wrong team by accident, they can log into their participant center and update their team membership. Next, we have our participant page layouts. Allows users to change the layout of their personal page. Typically, you probably won't want to do this. You probably want to keep users leveraging the same layout unless if you have an explicit reason to change this. Next, we have the returning user login page location. I typically advise setting this to the first step. This creates the least intrusive registration flow experience for your registrants. The reason for that is if we were to set third step as the registration or returning user page location, what can happen is some users may forget their login credentials and may need to go through the forgot password or forgot username workflow. And in so doing, they can potentially be bumped out of the registration flow. And if we set the returning login page to the third step, the user may have gone through a considerable amount of effort fine-tuning the registration up to the third step. And if they then have to go through the password reset process and get bumped out of the registration flow, they then have to re-enter the registration information. So prompting users to log in first reduces the odds of creating an inconvenience for your registrants. So I always recommend setting first step. So next, the next thing I want to touch on is donor honor roll sorted by name. This determines whether your donor honor rolls are sorted alphabetically instead of by the size of their gifts. And once we have established these options and we're satisfied, we click next to save our options and move on to sub-step C, define miscellaneous options. So here we have what I want to touch on are options 2, 3, 4, and 5. This allows you to leverage or establish the interval for automated autoresponders. So what I mean is, with TeamRaiser, you have a set of 4 autoresponders which can trigger based on a numeric day value after registration. So we can send a registration autoresponder that triggers X number of days after registration that says, thanks for registering. You might want to consider reaching out to your network to let them know that you've registered and encourage them to support you. You could send another one that says, you should go ahead and update your personal page. We found that this is really beneficial. Or you can also create conditionalizations that check to see whether the users have sent emails out or already personalized their page, and encourage, either thank them for engaging in these actions or encourage them to do so to help maximize their fundraising potential. So there's a total of 4 of these time delay autoresponders that you can leverage, and here's where you define those delays. We'll talk about those autoresponders again in a bit, but this is where you can establish those time frames. The next thing I want to touch on are options 9 and 10, rich text editor for suggested messages and rich text editor for content and participant pages. This allows you to enable for your participants what's called a rich text editor. It allows your users to enter, finely formatted content, but specifically links and images that exist either in Microsoft Word or on the web. So for instance, an image must live on the web, and they can drag the image from another web page into their editing window to insert an image either into their suggested message that they want to send out from the participant center or onto their personal page. So enabling this will not enable a rich text editor for either of these within the admin environment. Just be aware of that. A lot of users, the first time they're walking through this, expect that enabling this will give their admins a rich text editor as well. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Let's go ahead and move on next. Once I'm satisfied with my options, I click next, save my changes, and this brings us to substep D, configure participant center override options. So for the most part, you probably won't need to override your participant center options, but the most frequently leveraged one would be the page to display after logout. So from here, we can click select and either assign a unique page, illuminate, or we can just assign the greeting page as the page to display. Typically, that's what users will see, but it's entirely dependent on how you have things configured. The next 2 sets of options may not even be visible in your environment, but if they are, we'll go ahead and touch briefly on these. The OCI options stands for on-site check-in options. So by and large, this is a feature that you won't leverage, so we won't go into too much depth here. I'm just going to move on to configure e-commerce options. Likewise with OCI, this is not heavily leveraged, but this allows you to make use of the Illuminate Online e-commerce tool and associate it and predefined products with your TeamRaiser event so that users, potential donors, can purchase products and the purchase value is credited to your TeamRaiser event, potentially, as you can see from options 4 and 5, to individual participants and or teams. So once we're satisfied with our changes, we click finish, and this brings us back to select event options. Next is step 4, select team options. So from here, we can determine whether or not teams are leveraged at all. And so we want to look at step 2 or option 2. We check this box to either allow or disallow team creation. By and large, you'll probably want to keep this box checked so that you can create teams for your event. Another thing I want to talk about is company association. Option 6, there's 2 checkboxes. The first checkbox determines whether or not a team captain can associate their team with a company, and the second checkbox determines whether or not individual participants who are not associated with a team to associate their individual registration with a company. And then we have company selection. This allows us to show a selectable list only of existing companies. So if you're leveraging companies with your TeamRaiser configuration, you can display this as a drop-down list, and users are then restricted to only selecting one of the companies that you have created for them. If you leave this unchecked, you can present the option of entering your own company during the registration process. Next, before I move on, I would click Save to save my changes. Next, under Related Actions, is our Edit Team Captain Questions. I can click on this, and this allows us to determine whether or not we have questions that are presented only to our team captain. So if I have not yet created the questions that are explicit for team captains, I can add a question, or I can check the box next to an existing question to determine, yes, this is a question presented to team captains. So once I'm satisfied with my team captain question designations, I click Finish to save my changes, and it brings me back to step 4, Select Team Options. So now that I'm satisfied with my team configurations, I click Next, save my changes, and this brings me to step 5, Team Divisions. Team divisions are typically not large, but allows you to create a set of buckets that you can group and organize teams by. The best example I can share with you about team divisions is working with an organization that was associated with the NFL, and it allowed donors to make a gift on behalf of their favorite NFL team, and the funds raised for each team would be designated to various food banks in the team's home city. And so the divisions were the actual NFL team divisions, like the NFC East, NFC West, etc. So that's team divisions. Once we're satisfied with our divisions, we click Next, and we move on to Associate Upsells. Here's where we can determine whether or not we're going to present things like water bottles, T-shirts, etc. to our participant. So we can create an upsell under Related Actions, assign a name, an external identifier, choose a TeamRaiser type. I typically recommend leaving it blank. Step B allows us to set options like the name, description, options in the label for the checkbox list or the select list. We can choose then option 5, our checkbox or select, and then finally whether or not this option is selected by default. We click Finish to save our changes. I'll pretend like I've created one, and it brings us back to Associate Upsells, and I'll click on Select a Registration Upsell to choose an upsell that has been created. I click Next after selecting my upsell, and this allows me to review my upsell options, and we can see we have things like price and sizes available. And then I can also set a pre-selected option for the size. Once I'm done, I click Finish, and now I can see my upsell or upsells listed here. Once I'm satisfied with my upsell designations, I click Next, and this brings me to step 7, Manage Participation Types. From here, I can either edit an existing type, do things like name it, update the description, update the registration fee, choose whether or not fundraising is enabled. A reason why you would not want to enable fundraising for a specific participation type could be if you're leveraging TeamRaiser registrations to manage volunteer registration. So maybe you don't want volunteers to have to worry about creating a password or having a participant center. You can just uncheck this box and it will collect registrations, but the users who register with this type will not have a participant center associated or a personal page. Option 6 allows us to designate a minimum fundraising goal. We can say you cannot have a fundraising goal any less than the value here. Next is Delayed Self-Pledge Enabled. This allows you to enable the DSP or Delayed Self-Pledge option for this participation type. What this is, in a nutshell, it allows you to say users who register with this type must fundraise a minimum amount, whatever their fundraising goal is, and then if they don't reach their goal by a designated date, you can charge the card that they used to register with the difference that they did not raise. So typically you want to have strong verbiage about this, and typically that's included in the waiver. So once I'm satisfied with my participant type options under sub-step Identify type, I click Next and move on to Type Options. So I can set a category I can determine whether or not this type is available or inactive, and I can also notify admins with option 5 whether or not someone has registered with this type. Next, I move on to substep C, select registration info, where I determine which type of questions or biographical questions are presented and either requested or required. So this includes basic biographical information as well as snail mail and email opt-in options. Once I've set these, I click next and move on to substep D, customize waiver. So from here, I can determine whether or not a waiver must be agreed to in order for a user to continue through the registration flow. So this is where you can add things like an indemnification clause or strong language about the DSP and that users will be billed if they fail to reach their fundraising goal. So check the box, enter your content here, and then move on by clicking next to save our changes. Substep E, add banner image. I typically recommend against this, but this allows you to add an image next to this participation type within the registration flow, but it typically just adds clutter to the display. I click next, and this brings me to include upsells. This is where I can determine any upsells that I've associated with the event, whether or not they are presented to the user when registering with this participation type. In this case, let's say I do want to display the t-shirt option for this participation type. I click next, and now I can determine any questions that I've established, whether or not they should be presented to users who are registering with this type. So I'm going to go ahead and check the t-shirt size option and click finish. And this brings me back to manage participation types. Satisfied with either what I've done, or I could create a new participation type. I'm not going to spend time on this, but it's the exact same options we just walked through when editing our existing type. So it's very easy to create a new participation type, or if we don't want to walk through and create a type from scratch, we can use the copy option to duplicate an existing participation type, and it will retain our upsell options, waiver text, etc. So once I'm satisfied with my participation type settings, I click next and move on to my milestone options. I talked about being able to create milestones to present a badge on the personal page. Let's go ahead and walk through creating one of these. And so this will be my badge. I can enter a name. I can enter a description. And next, the most important part of this is the monetary amount, or the threshold, which must be achieved in order to trigger this milestone. Once I've set the first 3 options, I need to choose a participation type, which is eligible for this milestone. Of course, I just click next without designating a type, and that means no one will ever see it. You need to make sure you highlight it and click add. Once it's listed under your selections, then you can proceed, and that will ensure that users are actually going to be able to see this badge. Next is admin notifications. I mentioned that we can notify our admins when somebody reaches a certain fundraising threshold. This is how we do that. We can set our message text, and then we can designate who should be notified of this. And we can also determine the frequency in which these notifications are triggered. Once I'm satisfied with my options, I click next and move on to step C, add milestone detail to our autoresponder HTML. We'll talk about this again briefly, but we can customize the content that is displayed to our autoresponders upon achieving this milestone if, in fact, we choose to notify users. If we want to notify users, we need to make sure the box under option 1 is checked to send an autoresponder when the milestone is reached. We can customize the subject line, and then we can customize the content. Now, a bit of a note about this, it can sometimes be a little confusing, but the content that we set here is embedded within the autoresponder. And it's a little confusing, but like I said, we'll touch again on this in a moment. So here's where we set the milestone unique content for the notifications. Once we're satisfied with this content, we click next. And here's where we can update our plain text content. Anytime you make a change to the HTML content, you need to update the plain text. So we click on Update Plain Text and then click next to save our plain text updates. Finally, we have substep E, Configure Milestone Achievement Badge. This is where we determine whether or not a badge is actually going to be displayed on the participant's personal page for reaching this threshold. So if I check this box, I can search the image library, locate a badge, or I can choose a file from my desktop. And finally, then I can enter a name and a description and say maybe raised $100. And finally, once I'm satisfied with my options, I click finish, and this will bring me back to my milestones list. So I can either, after the fact, edit the badge and modify it, or I can delete it. Once I'm satisfied with my milestone configuration, I click next, and this brings me to step 9, manage discounts. So here I can create a discount, and so let's call it 100, and the discount will be $100 off. And the discount code, if we want to add a discount code, in other words, if we want users to have to enter a code during the registration flow, we enter that discount code here. If we leave this blank, the discount will be applied automatically. This is a way that you can create things like automatic early bird registration discounts. So we'll say we want to make this instead just a $10 off early bird registration discount. I click next. I set my fixed amount. I want this to be $10 off, but we can determine whether it's a percentage off or a fixed amount off. Once I'm satisfied, I click next, save my changes, and we can say maybe only this applies to the first 100 registrants. Only the first 100 will be able to receive this discount. Once I've set the discount availability, I click next, and we come to define eligibility. I typically recommend leaving this as is, leaving it blank. Click next, and then we can set our activation schedule and our expiration schedule. So this determines, exactly what, for instance, our early bird registration time frame is. Maybe it runs from June 25th through August 1st. Once we've set our discount options, we click on Approve Discount or Unapproved Discount to make it active or inactive. But either way, once I'm satisfied with my discount configuration, I click Finish, and this brings me back to my discounts list. Now, before it's actually able to be leveraged, we must associate our discount. And what we do is we click on Associate, we select a participation type, we click on Add, and click Finish. If you create a discount and users are reporting that the discount code that you provided them with is not working, and you are sure that the discount code is exact, but it still isn't working, it probably means it hasn't been associated. That's a common culprit behind discounts not working. So once we've created our discount and we've associated our discounts, we can click Next to move on to the next step. Step 10, Manage Stationery, is typically something that you won't need to worry about if you don't know HTML and aren't creating unique stationaries for this event. So we won't spend too much time on this page because we're not going to create a stationery today. So once we're satisfied with our stationery options, we click Next, and this brings us to step 11, Manage Autoresponders. This is where we can fine-tune the autoresponder content that is included when our participants or donors interact with our event. So we have our standard registration autoresponders, and we have our thank you for your gift autoresponders. We have autoresponders for reaching your goals or reaching 50% of your goal. We have notifications when someone donates on your behalf or someone joins your team. And then I mentioned that we have time delay autoresponders. We have those here: first, second, third, and fourth follow-up. They're disabled by default. You need to click Switch to Customized Version to enable those, and then you can enter that content, and these will be triggered based on the frequency that we established earlier during the advanced options setup. And then we have our congratulations for reaching a fundraising milestone autoresponder. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at this. I mentioned that while we talked about configuring a milestone, I mentioned that the content is embedded. So you may not see your content looking like this. Your editing window might look something like this if I switch over to the visual editor. And what we have then is our content, and this S405 participant notification content. This is where our milestone unique content gets embedded. So this is how it works. We can define unique content. It gets embedded here, and then this is the complete message that the user will see. Once we're satisfied with our changes, if we make any, again, update the plain text content, save it, and move on. And this brings us back to manage autoresponders. Once we're satisfied with our autoresponder configuration, we can click next, and this brings us to our suggested messages. Here's where we can create message templates or edit existing message template. If we click on add message, we can set a name. We can choose a message type, for instance, like solicit gifts. We can choose a message stationery to be leveraged. We can predefine a message subject. We can determine whether or not users can modify the subject. We can preset the message content, determine whether or not users can modify this content, and then finally determine whether or not this message is available. So this is very useful for creating things like a solicitation message. Not everybody is a copywriter, and not everybody is comfortable asking for donations. So pre-configuring a solicitation message can alleviate the potential uncomfortable burden for some of our fundraisers for asking friends or family members for a donation. Once we're satisfied with our suggested message configuration, we click next, and this brings us to step 13, customize pages. So here we can modify the TeamRaiser content pages. Next is we have this custom pages tab. We can create a custom page for things like miscellaneous event information. We enter an optional title, enter optional content, and then click finish, and our custom page has been created. Next, there's one more thing before I move on that I want to touch on, and that is Preview Participant Center under Related Actions. If we click on this, this will allow us to preview what our Participant Center will look like to our fundraisers or those who have registered. There's actually one other thing I want to touch on very briefly, and that is customize wrapper and styles. If you need to, you can override the wrapper that is assigned to your TeamRaiser event. Once we're satisfied with our page configuration or custom page configuration, we click next, and this brings us to customize event URLs. So here we can create a shortened URL, which is useful for promoting our event on things like social media, print media, things like that. I enter a URL, and then here under current URL, I can see my shortened URL, and now I can copy this and leverage this on Facebook or Twitter posts or in print media. Finally, we have closed event redirect URL. If we want to redirect users to a specific page upon closing an event, we can designate that URL here. Meaning, if we close an event and somebody has the event bookmarked or follows an old link from social media platforms, we can automatically redirect them to some alternative page. Once we set our URLs for our event, we can click next, and this brings us to step 15, test drive. So this allows us to walk through the dry run of the test drive or registration. Let us see what it looks like for our participants. So in this case, I'm going to click on Launch Test, and it gives me a pop-up window. I'll see any content that I've configured on my TeamRaiser event. I can click on one of the Join options to walk through the TeamRaiser registration. Now, to make sure that you are actually in the test registration, you will see in the URL up top, TRR Preview, meaning TeamRaiser Registration Preview. So if you're leveraging a highly custom wrapper, which is common from either Cathexis or Blackbaud templates, you might have custom call to actions, and just know that sometimes those custom call to action buttons will not actually allow you to leverage the TeamRaiser test drive functionality. So that can be confusing and frustrating. Just be aware of that. One other note about the test drive is you don't have to, by default, your admin email address will be listed under the test address. You can change this if you want to see how your autoresponders will look, for instance, in a Gmail or a Yahoo inbox. So once we've walked through our test drive, we're satisfied, we can click next, and this comes to step 16, configure cross-references. Now what needs to happen, and sometimes it can take a little while for this page to load, but what happens is your external database, which is synchronized with Luminate, will be connected with, and you can associate various aspects of this TeamRaiser with your database of record, which is synchronized here. Configure those cross-references as needed. So we can pretend that I've walked through and I've created cross-references. It's simple. You just select it, and it will appear in the right-hand side. Once we're done, we can click Save to save our changes, or Next to move on to the next step, which is the Publish step. This allows us to determine whether our event here, option 1, is published and accepting registrations only, accepting registrations and gifts, or accepting gifts only, or once it's past event time, we can close the event. And then finally, one of the most important things about the whole TeamRaiser configuration is right here, option 2, our TeamRaiser entry point, or the URL where users can actually access this. So if you have not configured a shortened URL, this is the URL that you will leverage to promote your TeamRaiser event to make sure that users can actually access it, register, and make donations. Once we're satisfied with all our settings, we click Finish, and this will bring us back to our TeamRaiser list. Now, this concludes the creation of a TeamRaiser event, and this is how you can configure a TeamRaiser event from start to finish, creating an event, fine-tuning all the options, and then finally how to promote it. So,
good stuff. All right. Thank you for that, Jeff. That's a lot of information, and had some great questions along the way. I was able to answer them as we went, but a couple I just wanted to mention quickly. And feel free if you have any additional questions. Obviously, there's a lot of nuances in there and a lot of like tweaking that can be done and a lot of customization. But if you have any questions or if you have any ideas or scenarios that you want to run by us, feel free to chat those to us, and we'll happy to stay on the line to address them. A couple of questions that I wanted to highlight is one was, if you add an achievement badge to an event in progress, would it be retroactive to anyone who has already registered? And technically, I would say, just assume it does not, but technically, if someone has already registered and you turn on badges later, they will apply, but they'll only apply to people that haven't triggered them yet. So, for example, if you have a milestone badge that someone will receive once they raise $1,000, but you don't turn it on until registration's already been open for a week, and one person has already raised $2,000 by the time you turn that achievement badge on, and another person has only raised $50 or nothing, the one that has already raised the $2,000 would not receive that badge, but if anybody else, like the person that raised 0 or 50, then gets a $1,000 donation, they would receive the badge. So it's always best to make sure you set up your achievement badges before you open registration, just so you don't have those caveats. And also, if you didn't see, for example, under event options, like 3E and 3F, 3E was for online check-in. That's probably a site data parameter that's not enabled on your instance to start with. And same thing with e-commerce, which is 3F. I don't believe those are necessarily turned on by default. I don't believe there's a charge for those, but you can check with your client success manager over at Blackbaud, or submit a case to the help desk to see if you need any of those, or feel free, if you're not sure even what those are, feel free to reach out to us or Blackbaud regarding those. But e-commerce can be kind of handy if you're selling things. If you have a store, in addition, you can sell things or have your participants sell things, and those can go towards their fundraising goal. So it just kind of builds in e-commerce store into your TeamRaiser and allows the fundraising to happen. And then Jeff showed you a lot of the cool things, touched on all the things about the divisions and companies and teams, and that can get very handy and very useful if you need additional hierarchy in your events. So if you ever have any questions or a use case that you're trying to figure out how to support a specific setup, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to assist. We're going to have some other webinars in this series, but it all starts with, first of all, configuring the TeamRaiser. And thank you, Jeff, for covering that so well and so completely. And thank you all for joining today, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions at all. And have a great day.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.